Welcome everyone to this, the first meeting of the Centre for European Philosophy seminar series, and it's a great pleasure that I'm introducing our own Neil Gascoigne. Neil, you'll all, I think, know. Neil's written widely on tacit knowledge, skepticism and pragmatism. I think the latest book is the one on royalty, liberal democracy and religious certainty, which came out a couple of years ago, I think it was now. And since then, you've written a few papers on royalty, including one with me, of all things, and in which we discuss royalty and truth, and said a few things straight there. So that's Neil's background. But today, Neil, you are talking about pragmatism, conceptual engineering, and the ethics of controversy. And I will now hand over to you.
Metaphorically.
You're going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then we'll take questions.
Oh, am I? Okay.
We'll give the same for 30 minutes, give or take.
Okay, I thought it was an hour. Okay.
Is it an hour?
That must require some quick rethinking on my part then.
No, that could be me. Sorry, let me just read.
I thought it was a 90-minute session, so I was. Anyway, well, should we see how it goes?
No, sorry, that's my bad.
I think there's normally been flexibility of between about 45 minutes to an hour.
Okay, forget what I said. Go 45 minutes to an hour. Neil, I do apologise.
That makes me feel much better. Otherwise, I've wasted my morning. Okay, thanks, Michael. What we're gonna do? Okay, I won't try and start up this off thing. Yes, yeah, okay. Okay, so this comes out of. First of all, I'd like to thank Henry for having invited me to this, even though Henry's not here. This is the first time I've allowed myself to be categorized as a European philosopher since the early days of the Society for European Philosophy. So, you know, maybe this is just a temporary one-off thing, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to join your ranks. This paper came out of a conference that somebody that Michael and I knows organised on conceptual engineering and pragmatism. So that's something I'm writing up at the moment. But what I thought I'd try and do is, for those who are not familiar with this kind of area, give them some a kind of overview of it. The headline of the paper is basically, pragmatists should have nothing to do with conceptual engineers or a bunch of analytic philosophers, because we'll get embroiled in problems that are not pragmatism's problems. But at the same time, what I'm really interested in is, and it depends who's actually here today, I guess, but certainly Nathan, obviously, what possible contribution can be made from especially from the kind of Deleuzian understanding of what philosophy is, because this is primarily a kind of meta-philosophical problem. So what I've got some slides to accompany my text, but I've got some little videos to start it all off with, one of which should make you feel really kind of uncomfortable. So let me see how I can do this. Oops, no, that didn't work. Okay, try that again. Right, I'm trying to play the computer sound, which has apparently just only become possible. Right, I'm going to turn the microphone off. So Michael is the only person I can see, because apparently it's supposed to play through the computer. And according to Michael, this works. So I'm looking at you, Michael. If this doesn't work when I turn the microphone off, then can you wave frantically? Can you hear me, Michael? Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
Who's your perfect guy?
Well, first of all, he's too humble to know he's perfect.
That's me.
He's intelligent, supportive, funny.
Intelligent, supportive, funny. Me.
Romantic and courageous.
Me also.
He's got a good body, but he doesn't have to look in the mirror every 2 months.
Great body, and sometimes I go months without looking.
He's kind, sensitive, and gentle. He's not afraid to cry in front of me.
This is a man we're talking about, right?
Okay, so that was
Neil, your sound is gone.
Hard to follow Bill Murray, I know, but hopefully it'll be a bit easier to follow the next two people involved in this one. So I'll move on to this one, and then I'll start the talk.
Leader, is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick, and it's great to talk to you.
Good to see you.
I just think that this issue has just become so divisive and toxic, and it pits people against each other, both groups who face discrimination in society, women and trans women. And I just find this debate incredibly unhelpful and unproductive, to be totally honest. At this conference, I want to speak about issues that affect people, whatever their gender and
we will
whatever
get to those,
their
I assure you.
sexuality.
But is it transphobic, yes or no?
Look, is it transphobic? Look, I don't even know how to start answering these questions. I just don't find them.
The party
helpful.
leader suggests it is. So what do you, as Shadow Chancellor, say?
I think that people should be able to identify with the gender that they feel comfortable
Respectfully,
with.
Shadow Chancellor, that wasn't my question. My question is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that.
Okay, right. Now, hopefully the reason for showing those two videos will become clearer as we go along. I picked up on the Rachel Reeves one because the Guardian's correspondent said, "Oh, terrible! All she does is go You'd have thought that some sort of special advisor would have at least given us some answer to that question. Of course, that's not my point. I think Rachel Reeves is genuinely unable to answer the question because she doesn't know what the answer is. In other words, it involves concepts that have not yet become kind of clarified. Obviously, in the case of Bill Murray, a slightly more light-hearted example of let's say, divergent understandings of what the concept man involves, right? And again, I'll come to the Bill Murray case as we go along, right? So, pragmatists are interested not in representing a purportedly ready-made reality, but in articulating prophetic future possibilities on the basis of values most treasured by a culture society in the present. Now, envisaging such futures is also a way of dramatizing dangers to those values. This is not utopian in intent. It's an endeavor to work out how we need to think about things and how we need to change institutions to ramify those values and resist assaults on them. It's an attempt to establish some sovereignty over the question, where are we headed, by asking, where do we want to go and how do we get there? Now, as presented, this makes pragmatism sound what some analytic philosophers have come to call conceptual engineering, which I'll shorten to CE. Firstly, conceptual engineers are interested in revising, or in their favoured term, ameliorating our ways of talking. And that implies some notion of how such projects of amelioration are to be evaluated. For example, Sally Haslanger, who's on the slide, her work on concepts of race and gender is often cited as the source of this recent development. In a series of papers published from the late 1990s onwards, she argues that the concept woman, for example, should be revised, ameliorated as it were, to mean something like targeted for subordination on the grounds of perceived features taken to relate to reproductive role. It is, for the most part, feminist theorists, she thinks, who've awakened us to this meaning, and her conclusion is that, quotes, part of the project of feminism is therefore to bring about a day when there will be no women. Now, a second point of similarity is that just as pragmatism has a meta-philosophical dimension, the aspirations of some conceptual engineers extend to the thought that if philosophy is to engage in the concept amelioration business, it must be alert to the need to engineer an appropriate concept of philosophy itself. For that reason, pragmatists and conceptual engineers spend more time talking about improving things than actually doing so. Now, despite these superficial similarities, however, the claim defended in this paper is that pragmatists should have nothing to do with conceptual engineers or conceptual engineering. that even to embrace the term is to risk becoming embroiled in disputes about the sorts of distinctions, appearance, reality, internalism, externalism, that non-pragmatists think they must settle before they get their hands dirty. Now, I can put this into a slightly broader kind of historical context. For Locke, you'll recall, the task of philosophy is to advance the work of science's master builders by impugning the use of, in his words, hard and misapplied words with little or no meaning. The 20th century saw a resurgent empiricism embrace the conviction that philosophy could retain something of its legislative edge by updating this Lockean image. But by mid-century, it seemed to some that if philosophy was to show genuine cognitive progress, it must abandon its under-labourer conceit and subject its own methodological assumptions to a more nature scientific scrutiny. The key figure here is Carnap. Although he abandons the ambition of the Aufbau to, quote, reduce all concepts to the immediately given, the method for clarification he alighted on, what he calls explication, is constrained by the requirements of similarity, exactness, fruitfulness, and simplicity. Now, since these are taken to characterize the shift from pre-scientific concepts to their more scientific counterparts, Carnap's message to philosophy was clear enough. It needs a more dramatic Copernican turn if it's to gain readmittance to what Locke called the Commonwealth of Learning. Oop, I think there we go. Yep. Now, explication is acknowledged as a precursor of conceptual engineering. As Carnap described it, explication is about transforming or replacing a concept that we grasp inexactly, what he calls the explicandum, with another which he calls the explicatum. And the explicatum answers to his four desiderata, the similarity, exactness, fruitfulness, simplicity thing. Now, this reliance on practical considerations makes the choice of language appropriate for the explicatum what he calls an engineering problem and not a metaphysical one. As a contribution to analysis, then, explication is in effect regarded as science's gift to philosophy. It's the method that a truly naturalistic empiricist philosophy, in true dialogue with the sciences, can take as its own. Now, as such, Carnap viewed explication as one of the most important tasks of philosophy, extending from the domains of science and common sense all the way through to the problems of philosophy itself. Now, if the interest in conceptual engineering has revived interest in Carnap's work, it's also returned to the spotlight Carnap's keenest critic. Now, for some, Peter Strawson's attack on explication as a philosophical method presents the most cogent challenge to the intelligibility of conceptual engineering. And that challenge is, I think, genuine enough, though mislocated, as we'll see, by would-be conceptual engineers. But here's what I think is the real challenge. I won't read out all this quote. The highlighted bits are the bits I'm talking about. This is from Strawson's piece on Carnap in the Library of Living Philosophers. Right. Strawson then characterizes programs like logical positivism and attempts to reduce the ordinary conditional to an elementary logical operation as driven by the conviction that, as he says, concepts which have proved successful for some purposes must be adequate for others. In other words, we can look at one area of ordinary language, as it were, and drawing conclusions from that, apply them across the piece. The kind of approach that Wittgenstein criticizes in a later work. From this, then, Strawson draws the following conclusion. From such attempts, we may learn much, but not by their succeeding. Part of what we have to explain and free ourselves from in dealing with them is the undue fascination exercised by formal systems. Now, This talk of formal systems alludes to a distinction that Strawson makes between what he calls the methods of rational reconstruction, which prescribes the model conduct of model worlds, and that which looks for philosophical understanding by quotes describing the actual conduct of actual words. And one way of presenting Strawson's objection to the model that might make it a challenge to conceptual engineering is that the more methodologically ambitious conceptual engineers share with Carnap a presupposition that the philosopher has access to a stable framework of metalinguistic concepts that aren't implicated in the messiness of ordinary language. An eyrie, as it were, from which to evaluate the transformative or ameliorative benefits of some proposed explicatum. Remember, that's the preferred concept. In spite of the differences, that resonates with Donald Davidson's judgment in Truth and Meaning, where he contrasts Tarski's method of inquiry with Carnap's. Tarski's, he says, follows from the formulation of the problem itself and not from the self-imposed restraint of some adventitious philosophical Puritanism. Returning to my opening claim then, the pragmatism that I want to warn against associating with conceptual engineering learned its own lessons from what Peirce calls the enginery of modern thought, and indeed from that history of failed attempts that Strawson alludes to. It takes more seriously the consideration that philosophy cannot retain the sort of methodological restraint associated with Carnap's semantic enterprise if it is to do what Dewey tells us it ought to do, which is to say, clarify men's ideas as to the social and moral strifes of their own day, rather like the ones that Rachel Reeves was involved with. The contention then is that conceptual engineering as a school or movement in analytic philosophy does not derive its solution to the problem of conceptual change from the problem itself, precisely because it's hamstrung by the sort of Puritanism that Davidson and Strawson associated with Carnap. This is the Puritanism that Richard Rorty, with in fact Davidson's description in mind, extends to all those who are committed to what he calls the construction of a permanent neutral framework for inquiry that tries to shape the problem to fit the method of solution and not the other way around. Right, so that takes me to, as it were, some more of the meat. So I want to have a look then at a particular influential conceptual engineer, a guy called Herman Kappelan, who used to be at St Andrews, then went back to Oslo, and I think now is teaching at the University of Hong Kong. Now, the analytic philosopher who's written most about conceptual engineering is Herman Kappelan. So having set Rorty over and against conceptual engineering, it's worth noting that in Kappelan's recent book, Fixing Language, Kappelan finds a quote from Rorty so good that, like New York, it's named twice. And here it is. Philosophy is the greatest game of all, precisely because it's the game of changing the rules. This game can be won by attending to the patterns by which these rules are changed and formulating rules in terms of which to judge changes of rules. Those who take this view hold that philosophy in the old style, philosophy as metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, needs to be replaced by meta-philosophy. Members of this school are, as it were, the meta-philosophers' meta-philosophers. Since any metaphysical, epistemological, or axiological arguments can be defeated by redefinition, nothing remains but to make a virtue of necessity and to study this process of redefinition itself. So like I said, Kappelan quotes this twice at different places, exactly the same piece of text, at two places in his book. The book came out in 2018. Now, in respect of it then, Kappelan, there he is, makes 3 points. He says, Rorty is saying that old school philosophy should be replaced by conceptual engineering. He says the process of redefinition can itself change over time. And finally, that 2 means that, to quote Kappelan, the meta-semantics itself can evolve over time. Now, apropos of one, Kaplan humbly concedes that, quotes, Rorty didn't say this in the context of endorsing my theory of conceptual engineering. He went on to use these points for somewhat tangential purposes. So what is old-style philosophy being replaced with? Kaplan is admirably vague on this question. Although he regards it as the central topic in philosophy, he considers the topics, as a quote, the topic so broad, multifaceted and amorphous that it doesn't lend itself to snappy slogans or tidy theoretical frameworks. Nevertheless, he does offer us a snappy-ish slogan and a very neat theoretical framework, which he calls the austerity framework. And here's a quote that relates to that. Conceptual engineering should be seen as having as its goal to change extensions and intentions, what he calls the semantic values, of what he calls our representational devices. And we should think of that process within an externalist framework. Now, turning to 2 and 3, Kaplan, so this is these two, the process of redefinition itself changing and the link with metasemantics. Kaplan takes it that that conceptual engineering requires that semantic values change, and that is in a sense partly a meta-semantic project. The claim that redescription can be redefined then, Rorty's claim, amounts to the claim that meta-semantics can change. And here's an example he gives. I'll just read an exerted version of this. The significant element of contestation in many of the cases, think of marriage and rape, contributes to changes in the meta-semantics. And those engaged in conceptual engineering aren't forced to follow past patterns. Of course, we are no more in control of these meta-semantic changes than we are in control of the changes in the semantics. But we should still think of both as being constantly in flux. Now, Kaplan's no control talk draws attention to an important constraint here. One way of construing whatever phenomenon we want to capture by theorizing about conceptual change, conceptual engineering, is in terms of mind changing. Whether we choose to frame semantic changes in terms of representational devices or concepts or just the homely ways of talking about, our targets are language users. But although mastering a language is an individual achievement, semantic norms are in some sense of the word external to any individual's control. To take a classic example from Putnam, Mo may think he's mastered the concept elm, and that when he asks an arborist to cut down the elms, he's issuing a command over which he exercises semantic authority. But if he can't tell an elm from a beech or an oak, the arborist does not miscarry if he chops down only the former. Somebody turn off their microphone, please. Somebody's got a mic on. I can. Thanks a lot. No. Hello, can you turn your mic off, please? Thanks. No. Who is that? Right. If Mo can't tell an elm from a beech or an oak, the arborist does not miscarry if she chops down only the former. She hasn't failed to understand his request. Rather, he has failed to say what he wanted to say. Now, the dilemma here, I think, is clear enough. If mind changing is too easy, too internalistic or intentionalist, we confront problems raised by elms, etc., which dramatize the co-development of expertise and semantic authority. The fact that we defer to certain experts as to the proper meaning of what elm is, right? And all various other things. But it also, of course, becomes difficult to see how changing minds can issue in the sort of coordinated social change that conceptual engineers are interested in. If it becomes too easy to change someone's mind, then it becomes a matter of how do we change en masse, right? How do we get widespread social changes to take part? Now, Kaplan is surely right then to want to purge philosophy of internalist dogmas, things that turn too much on individuals. But the solution for the pragmatist is not to flip the other way. The problem is that by reducing the intentionalistic to, as Kaplan says, and this is a quote, the grains of salt that might contribute to a massively complex dish, he makes mind changing dependent wholly on factors that are external to the minds of external to individual minds. Indeed, as a meta-semantic externalist, Kaplan characterizes himself as unapologetically skeptical about the role of intentions at all semantic levels in conceptual engineering, and apologetically skeptical about our ability to actively and intentionally improve our representational devices. As he says, amelioration, this is a quote, might happen, i.e. we can make our representational devices, our language, our talk about better, but if it does, it has little to do with our intentional effects. Now, note the divergence from Rorty's concern here. When Rorty goes on to identify the quoted position with Dewey's metaphilosophical pragmatism, he specifically associates this with what he calls an ethics of controversy. The point of redefining the rules is to prevent the sort of formalistic ossification that Strawson rails against in relation to Carnap. It's to keep the conversation between philosophers going in the hope that human beings will come up with new ideas for how we might live better lives. Now, this theme will find its fullest expression in Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, but even back in 1961, which is when the quote from Rorty was taken, Rorty was saying that old-style philosophy should be replaced by pragmatism, albeit on metaphilosophical grounds. Now, that might be tangential, referring back to that quote from Kaplan, to Kaplan's concerns, but it isn't to ours, because talk of representational devices and externalist frameworks is motivated by the sort of adventitious Puritanism that metaphilosophical pragmatism is meant to undercut. So whatever conceptual engineering is, it isn't what Rorty envisaged would replace old-style philosophy. Rather, it's just another iteration of it. Now, that conviction is reinforced when we turn to 2. Remember that? This one. The process of redefinition can itself change over time. Which apparently, Kaplan says, Rorty missed. Now, in Rorty's terms, appending the claim that redescription can be redefined adds nothing to metaphilosophical pragmatism. The aim of the latter is precisely to keep the, if you must use the term, meta-semantics on the move by subverting the ambitions of those philosophers prone to taking their formalisms for genuine explanations and applying them across the piece, as Strawson warned against. This is how to ensure that problems are taken on their own terms and not being subject to some abstract formalism. Now, Rorty subsequently came to think that metaphilosophical reflections aren't preeminent, but he continued to cleave to the notion that if philosophy is to be of any use, it is in helping remove obstacles to the sort of revisionary thinking that might help us solve real problems, remove obstacles to that, by embracing them in their actuality. And that might involve anything potentially ameliorative, from the ravings of poets to the protestations of climate change activists. Kaplan's formalist lexicon is not a way of taking the problem of conceptual engineering on its own terms. If there is an ambition for CE, for conceptual engineering, it's how to keep the conversation going. And talking about amelioration in terms of improvements to our representational devices is the sort of empty compliment that latter-day Carnapians like to pay to the linguistic innovations that subsequently pay off. Indeed, with respect to the whole of contestation, we might classify Kaplan's approach as taking the ethics out of Rorty's ethics of controversy, and thus out of conceptual engineering. Right, so the next section, ethics and amelioration. Now, Kaplan thinks that there are 2 challenges to the integrity of CE. The first is the challenge from externalism. Now, although Kaplan concludes that conceptual engineering is a process we have little or no control over, quotes, and it's not transparent to us when we engage in it, another quote, he nevertheless continues to assert the compatibility of externalism at all semantic levels and conceptual engineering. Now, my response has been to suggest that his attempt to square his meta-semantics with conceptual engineering threatens to squeeze the ethics out of Rorty's ethics of controversy, and thus much of what interests us about contestations and controversy in the first place, like, for example, the one that Rachel Reeves found herself in. The second challenge takes us back to Strawson, but I think that is seen in a clearer light by exploring Kaplan's claim that the externalist challenge is felt more keenly by the social constructivist, because there it bears on the very possibility of amelioration. In other words, Kaplan tries to lend a certain support for his way of understanding conceptual engineering by contrasting his approach with Sally Haslanger's, right? So that's what I'm going to talk about now. Right. Let me see where we got the thing. Here we are. I got this in the wrong order. Right. In the film Groundhog Day, as we know, the misogynistic weatherman Phil Connors finds himself reliving the same eponymous day over and over again. At one point in the film, the following exchange takes place. So this is, all I've done is just, it's a transcription of the video right at the beginning. What are you looking for? The perfect guy, blah, 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 right? Right, let me just flip back. Right. Crudely put then, Phil objects to the claim that Rita's perfect man, RPM, is a man. So Phil avows XY. RPM, Rita's perfect man, isn't a man. And Rita demurs. So she claims not XY. Rita's perfect man is a man. Now, of course, Haslanger does not discuss Groundhog Day, but she's far too serious for that. Now, according to Haslanger, concepts like man, woman, etc., fall into three classes, which she calls manifest, operative, and target. So this is just her critical jargon, right? So I just put up on that handout there, the PowerPoint, what these mean. So the manifest target, she thinks, is the one that we think we're using, right? So those people who say, yes, you know, they commit themselves to a particular understanding of the concept woman, but actually that's not the concept. When it comes to their actual actions and statements in the world, that's not the one that they live up to. So the operative concept, that captures the way it's used in practice. So there's probably a kind of a conflict in most people's cases in some concepts between the manifest concept, the one they think they're using, and the operative concept, the one that it appears to others that they are actually using. So somebody might be committed to you know, kind of equality, and yet manifest, you know, prejudice in their language, right? And then there's the target concept, and this is the one that we ought to be using, right? So let's relate that to Groundhog Day. So during the course of the film, Phil comes to realize that if he's to seduce Rita, he must track her manifest concept, as in the concept man, RPM, right? And that his recurrent failures are due in part to his inability to operationalize it. So he thinks he understands what it is that Rita means by a man, and he attempts, as it were, to become that person, become such a man, but he constantly finds that running against his actual dispositions. And again, if you see the film, you'll realize, often to hilarious effect. Now, it's estimated, according to Harold Ramis, that it takes Phil about 30 to 40 years to change his mind. And therein lies the film's ethical content, right? But the relevant target concept, man, isn't ameliorated. And therein, isn't ameliorated because the associated stretch of social reality is predetermined. In other words, Phil changes to fit the world. So recall the case of Moe. We can only determine that Moe's concept elm does not mean what he thinks it means or intends it to mean, because we have established taxonomic practices embodied in a culture of cognitive deference. In other words, we trust arborists who identify trees and not just the members of the general public. So what Moe means is what we mean, where the scope of the we is constituted by those deemed expert in the determination of the relevant scientific facts. Likewise then, Phil doesn't have a different concept man from Rita when he avows XY. The target concept, which Rita was aware of all along, was already determined by the cinematic universe. And once Phil aligns his behaviour with it, he's released from his eternal recurrence. So in that respect then, it merely dramatises the fact that to open up a gap between Phil's manifest and the target concepts, one requires a practice that carries the authority that scientific knowledge does to determine real meanings, but here in the social realm of values. In other words, for Haslanger's analysis to work, one needs something to do for man what botany does for elm. Another way of putting this, a rather clunky way, is to say that in Groundhog Day, the meta-semantics are fixed. They're fixed because man is going to mean what we understand it to mean, and the comedic value, of course, of Groundhog Day dramatizes that or exploits that, right? Presumably somebody an audience consisting of people who are just like Phil at the beginning of the film just wouldn't find it funny, right? But that's an obvious case where in some sense we understand as observers where it is that Phil's going wrong, and in some sense we applaud his success when he eventually becomes, as it were, the man he always could have been. But what about cases where there's a far more significant element of contestation and a corresponding lack of clarity about the meta-semantics? So let's take a more contentious example. So XX, trans women aren't women. Not XX, trans women are women, right? Now, this is not exactly the question that, that Rachel Reeves was asked, but it's clearly deeply related, right? Now, on Kaplan's account, XX will turn out to be true or false, depending on toing and froing between shifting semantic and meta-semantic rules that are too complex to identify until after it's all over. That's why he's ultimately quite, as it were, pessimistic about how intentional a process this is, right? Because according to his austerity framework, we have there's very little wriggle room, the grain of salt thing, for people to change anything, right? And in some sense, it's obvious, right? This will work out one way or the other. We don't know which way it will work out, but it will work out one way or the other. Great, great contribution there. Now, for Haslanger, this is a really quite interesting case, right? A difficult case. As we noted, her suggestion back in the noughties is that we engineer the concept woman to mean subordinated on the basis of perceived sexual characteristics, like biological sexual characteristics, because they pertain to reproduction. Now, on one reading of that, XX is false. In other words, she would agree that trans women are women. But for her, the political project is to eliminate women. And if there's one thing that parties on both sides of this agreement will agree on, it's that the concept involves positive content that is integrated into an identity, right? So the one thing that people don't want to do who are involved in this disagreement is say there are no such thing as women, right? They wouldn't regard that as an amelioration of our concepts, as an improvement of our conceptual situation, right? Now, notwithstanding that issue, Kaplan's response is that Haslanger's model of amelioration is what he calls revelatory, because the social reality that gives concepts their externalist credentials already exists in its ideal form. In other words, to reinforce the point, just as Phil finally comes to meet the pre-established standards of the Groundhog universe when one goes from believing that XX to believing that XY to not XY, or vice versa. The change involves, just as Phil finally comes to meet the pre-established standards of the Groundhog universe, when he comes to see that Rita's perfect man is a man. When one goes from believing that XX to believing not XX, or vice versa, the change involves the revelation that this is what we really ideally meant all along. So that's what Kaplan thinks is going on with Haslanger. So for Kaplan, on the other hand, the change, which is due to these shifting semantics that we can't really say anything about, would be to the semantic value of woman, so that either it includes or excludes trans women. So on this account, Haslanger's view is not ameliorative because the concept doesn't change, whereas in Kaplan's view, it is ameliorative because we literally change the extension of the word woman, the concept woman, to include trans women as well. So again, that's because for Haslanger, just as as it were, the cinematic universe determine the correct meaning or extension of man to include Rita's perfect man, just as that's fixed by the writers and the expectations of the audience, for Haslanger, her definition of what a woman is as somebody who is discriminated against on the basis of their perceived reproductive characteristics, that she thinks has been established by another set of experts, which are feminist philosophers. But of course, one of the contestations that we have at the moment is the role of feminist philosophers in this kind of debate, right? As we know with Kathleen Stock and others, right? So that's in that sense, Haslanger's view doesn't really give us much help because she's relying on the idea that there are experts here, right? We can all agree that the experts are, like we can agree that arborists are tree experts. Now, stepping back then, we have a contestation here. So from a pragmatist perspective, between amelioration as Kaplan would have it, improvements to our representational devices, or amelioration as revelation of a pre-existing social reality, fixed either by the groundhog universe or by, from Haslanger's perspective, by feminist theorists. Or to sloganize, how can I resist? The choice is between Kaplan's amelioration without ethics and Haslanger's ethics without amelioration. Now, the pragmatist response to this is that it's a formalistic difference that makes no difference at all. Haslanger's error is to model her externalist semantics of the social on the sort Kaplan would favor for the real simpliciter. Mo cannot intend Elm to mean what his use implies because the target for experts in the really real have their semantic the semantic content is controlled by factors external to those experts, i.e. the fact that elms really are the way they are. So such practices reveal the real rather than change it. Likewise, if an expert in values is to have any authoritative basis for her critique, it's on the grounds that she too is describing social reality. But if one thing is clear, it is that this aspect of reality has no such experts. If what it is to be an expert is to be someone to authorize to define the real, even if temporarily. But if we efface the divide between the social and objective reality, then the ideal real distinction just becomes the best, or so the ideal/real just becomes the best that we've come up with so far. If the imperative is to get folk to think about themselves and others on the basis of that, with the proviso that the best can always be bettered, there is no tension between amelioration and ethics. Now, Kaplan would rather locate Haslanger's contribution to conceptual engineering in a different dialectical context, the one that I've suggested, according to which she sacrifices amelioration in order to wriggle out from under what he calls the Strawsonian challenge. And he interprets this as the charge that conceptual engineering will always involve an unacceptable change of topic. In other words, if you change, how do you find the distinction between talking about women and that you're still talking about women, or that you've changed what it is that you're talking about, right? So if you include trans women under the concept women, have you just changed what women are, or have you just included more people under the concept women, right? Now, as per the misreading of Rorty, Kaplan misses the real Strawsonian challenge, as I've said, which I think is about formal systems. Rather than look at Kaplan's attempt to respond to the Strawsonian challenge then, I want to turn finally to a recent defense shortly of conceptual engineering by a German philosopher philosopher based in the States called Vera Flocker, who deliberately tries to reintroduce an element of agential control, i.e. of intentional action, right? In that sense, and I think her paper marks a return of the kind of ethically repressed. As I want to show now, of course, she ends up with exactly now the flip side of the problem, because she's operating within the same kind of formal structure. Now, there's Flocker, right? Now, Flocker is not a pragmatist, of course. Her text is replete with phrases like the representation of the world through language and such have you, all right? And she agrees with Kaplan that while conceptual engineering does not involve engineering concepts in Haslanger's sense, it does stand in need of an adequate meta-semantics, which is what she tries to provide. And she's deeply influenced, as she says, by Carnap. But whereas Kaplan thinks that ameliorative projects are inconsistent with social constructionism, Flocker thinks that Kaplan's externalism makes it impossible to see how mind changing can be placed within an individual's control, and that therefore some version of constructivism must form the basis of an adequate meta-semantics. So again, what we have here is a toing and froing between a realist semantics and a social constructivist semantics, where each then misses the vital part, I claim, of the picture of why we're interested in contestation and conceptual change in the first place, right? So crucially then, although her proposal is intended to accommodate the possibility of changing minds, she strives only not to be inconsistent with versions of meta-semantic externalism. So then she says, so although she talks in places about changing and quotes, hopefully improving our representational devices, it's not clear where the ameliorative element will come in. Whatever one makes of this representational talk, we can all agree, I think, that change is all too frequently not for the better. So, Flocker's proposal is simple enough. When we engineer concepts, we change some aspect of how we assess the truth of propositions. So, oh, gracious, sorry, I'm trying to get my, okay, there we go. So if I assume that woman is in part a biological category and that biological sex is fixed at birth, I will judge that XX. Whereas if I assume that woman is a category of self-identification, then I will judge not XX. Now, if we accept that folk disagree and change their minds about things, then we take it that in broad terms, the things in question retain sufficient stability across that change. That is not to say that teasing out these assumptions is an easy or a simple business. The complexity and diversity it reveals might be tantamount to identifying divergent forms of life. Indeed, cultural pressure points often have a tip of the iceberg feel to them. But when it comes to this Socratic spadework, formalistic concerns with fixing the reference of specific terms and attendant ontological worries don't contribute. Likewise, if someone suggested we settle the matter by consulting the gods, the Quran, tea leaves, ethicists, or evolutionary biologists, calling these meta-semantic shifts does not add very much. Now, as it stands, Flocker's proposal, so this one about when we engineer concepts, we change some aspect of how we blah, 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 seems like a common sense thesis. So let's call it CST, common sense thesis. But contrast Kaplan's view. He wants to argue that if I insist on the idiom mind changing, then I'm merely putting an intentionalistic spin on meaning changing. So we have a theoretical choice. Changing minds is either a matter of belief change or it's a matter of meaning change. And to the pragmatist, this is of course a fundamental error, because there is no method one can use to make this determination a priori. Nevertheless, the Puritan needs a theory to make the contrast probative. So for Kaplan, it's a pure externalist semantics that allows him to make that distinction. To see Flocker's response, let's return to the Strawsonian challenge. Flocker wants to establish that when we we can make sense of the idea that when somebody goes from asserting XX to asserting not XX, she's changing her mind and not merely changing the topic. She's still talking about women. She's not talking about a replacement for women. Since she wants to remain studiedly neutral on what it is that fixes the semantic value of XX, the mind-changing ethical element has to be redeemed by incorporating it into the meta-semantics of the assessor's standpoint. So this leads Flocker to endorse what she calls the possibility semantics over possible world semantics. So I haven't got time to go into this, but if anybody's interested in more, I can a long version of the paper. Now that leads Flocker to endorse, so when somebody goes from believing XX to believing not XX, what is being registered, she thinks, is not a shift in objective reality, but in subjective reality. This is her language, not mine. So equally, S can believe that XX and R can believe that not XX, and both can have true beliefs because, like judgments of taste, the individual standpoint enters into the context of evaluation. So the crazy thought here is that we can just mean different things. So to redeem the possibility of people actually changing their mind, she takes it that we have this kind of subjective viewpoint that indexes to the truth. This is on what the difference between possibility semantics and possible world semantics. So she holds this view. All right, I've already got time to go into that. Right, in conclusion. Now, Flocker is aware that her meta-semantics risks construing truth as a dyadic property, right, as a relational property between a person, a world, and say, an object. And she insists that we can retain the Tarskian monadic conception. I have my doubts, but the point is that accommodating it means the following. This is a quote from Flocker. Standpoint-dependent realities are more fine-grained than objective reality. People who seem to live in the same physical universe may nevertheless occupy different individual realities. Now, for the pragmatist, I think this is a devastating concession to make. I think for anybody, it's a devastating concession to make. Consider the following example. On the 21st of June, the BBC broadcast an interview with the artist Jess Duvals about the fact that her work had been pulled from the Royal Academy's gift shop after allegations that she'd posted transphobic comments. During the course of the interview, she said, "I can't make myself believe something I don't believe to be true. We now talk about the biological fact that there are only two sexes as an opinion. When does that become an opinion? I don't exist to validate other people's ideas of themselves." Now, I offer this up not because I endorse Duvall's position. The point rather is that I cannot see how to distinguish opinion and people's ideas of themselves from Flocker's subjective reality. When someone tells us they dislike Marmite, we're puzzled and perhaps even saddened, but we don't think their error is cognitive. We don't advance arguments to change their mind. But when someone contests XX, they are interested in the truth simpliciter. The introduction of individual realities is supposed to be rather more than a metaphysical apology for opinion, of course. Flocker's constructivism is motivated by what we might call the paradox of worldliness. Right. Conceptual engineering is about changing the way we think about the world, but we think about the world using words, the meaning of which are fixed by the world. That's the challenge of the externalist challenge, as Kaplan identifies it. Now, for pragmatists, POW is an antediluvian concern. But the point I want to emphasize is that it arises for Flock because Flock has to promote her common sense thesis as a meta-semantic principle of mind changing. And to do that, she needs to isolate it from externalism. But that in turn detaches mental content, i.e. what people think, their opinions and such have view, from any essential world involvedness. For the pragmatist, contrast between individual and objective reality, like that between social and natural reality, are yet more versions of Kant's noumenal phenomenal distinction, where earnest petitions for the reality of one are undermined by the implied ontological or cognitive superiority of the other. Indeed, my suspicion here is that the attempt to formulate a meta or a meta-meta semantics of conceptual engineering is a continuation of more familiar debates in the metaphysics of mind, which for some of us, Wittgenstein and pragmatism have helped dispose of. To finish, as Strawson reminds us, from such attempts we may learn much, but not by their succeeding. Part of what we have to explain and free ourselves from in dealing with them is the undue fascination exercised by formal systems. Right, I shall leave it there. Very long. Ah, gracious me, tired myself out.
Great, thank you very much, Neil. That's brilliant. I think I better stop recording now, so I'll just do that.